The Holy Gospel according to John, the 2nd chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
On the third day there was a wedding at Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Hallelujah. You may be seated. I don't know if you were here a few weeks ago when we had our Wednesday night Epiphany service. It was a great time with lots of candlelight and delicious food and the potluck that followed afterwards. If you were here, you probably noticed the bounty of food that everyone had brought. But you probably didn't see the anxiety that was going on in the kitchen and in the fellowship hall with all the people who were keeping everything going. Because the lasagna, we had planned for 100 people, but we had 150, and so the lasagna was running out. And we were nervous that someone may not be able to get some of this main course. Now, granted, there was a lot of great stuff, and there would have been enough food for everyone, but still it was a little embarrassing to see that maybe not everyone was going to be able to get some lasagna. And so I saw some of the confirmands, scraping bits off of some pans to try to make some pieces of lasagna so that it could last. Luckily, we didn't have to do that because I think we ended up, after the last person went through, with like 3 pieces maybe. We had just enough so that everyone could have some food. This is a problem, a fear that many of us have whenever we host a party or have a dinner. We make sure we have plenty of food, more than we could possibly eat, so that we don't run out and so that there's enough for everyone. It's why about the second week of December, you wish that you could never see a turkey sandwich ever again. Because when you planned that feast at Thanksgiving, you knew that you were going to be making much more than you would even eat at that meal. My wife and I do this all the time when we have people over or throw parties. We have way too much food, and we end up having lots of extra cheese and crackers to last us for snacks for weeks to come, and usually it goes bad before we can finish it all. Because this is something we're always nervous about. We don't want that embarrassment of running out. In this sermon, or in this story that we hear from John's Gospel today, Jesus and his mother and his disciples are at a wedding where the wine runs out. It's inconvenient, sure, and it's embarrassing, of course. And so all of us have probably been at a wedding where the open bar probably closed a little too soon for some people's liking. But this is different. In this time and place, 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, or in Israel, running out of wine early at the wedding feast wasn't just some sort of social faux pas. It's a disaster. Wine wasn't merely something you do at a party to have fun. You see, it's a sign of the harvest, of what God has given you that year. It's a sign of God's abundance and joy and blessing on your life, especially the newlywed couple. And the hospitality that they show reflects who they're going to be in the years to come. And so when they run short of wine at their own wedding feast, When they run short of that, they run short of blessing. And it turns their wedding very quickly into a tragedy. Now, what Jesus does, or really what Jesus is coerced by his mother to do, mothers have a great way of doing that, is that he turns these 6 cisterns of water into wine. We've heard this story our whole lives. I did the math, and it comes out to about, with these 6 that all hold about 30 gallons of wine, Jesus gives the party enough for 908 bottles of wine. I don't know if you've ever been at a wedding that has 908 bottles of wine, but I'm sure that they didn't make it through all of them, especially in a small little town at a small little wedding like this in Cana. This isn't a story, though, of drunken excess. It's a story, really, about the overwhelming grace and blessing of God. In John's gospel, this is the very first thing that he describes Jesus doing. This is the first sign, John says, of what he does. John uses the word sign instead of miracles all throughout his gospel, because he's trying to say that when Jesus does something, it's not just a magic trick, it's not just for show. There's more going on. It's a sign of something greater. The point of the story is not to show off another one of Jesus' abilities. It's a sign of something bigger. It's of Jesus' own character. What's going on here is describing, through story, the very nature of God. The way that Jesus does this shows that who the Son of God really is. John tells us that the first thing that Jesus does in his entire life in ministry is to provide more wine and joy and blessing to this couple, showing that he, or any other couple really, could possibly have even imagined or deserved. And by making this the very beginning of the story, John is showing us what Jesus' life is going to be like, what Jesus' ministry really, at the end of the day, is all about. This story shows us what God's grace looks like. The current trend in our culture and even in our church is borderline or even beyond borderline pessimism. We see the world more and more these days through the lens of scarcity, saying if only we had more. We don't have enough money. If only we had more money or food. If only we had more security or more power. If only we had more privilege and control. It's the worldview that we're fed through every commercial on television. It's the worldview we're fed through all political campaigns. And it's what we tell ourselves, if only I had more, when we go and buy a lottery ticket. It can be all too easy to look at grace then through this same lens of scarcity. We can say sometimes that we can talk about forgiveness in this way. In that, I admit that forgiveness of sins is essential and important element to our faith, but too often it's spoken of as the only element of our faith, as if Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were all just a simple transaction to pay for our shortcomings and mistakes. That's all faith is all about, sometimes people say. But grace is so much more than that. John shows us in this story is that grace more than makes up for something that we lack. It's providing more than we can ever imagine or even deserve. Because God doesn't stop pouring out grace when we've had enough. God doesn't just merely cover our shame. God's grace is over the top. It's abundant. It's more than enough, more than we could ever need. It's excessive, but not in a wasteful way. It's excessive precisely to show you just how abundant God's love for you is. Now, don't take this to mean that God's going to help you win the next time the Powerball hits an all-time high. I'm pretty sure none of us was able to rely on that this week. The abundance I'm talking about isn't self-serving. This kind of abundance isn't about financial prosperity or the success of us as individual people. As we heard in another reading this morning from 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul tells us that the Holy Spirit has given us, the church, a variety of gifts, a diversity of talents. And as anyone who's been around St. Mark since this fall knows, we have an abundance of talents. In this room alone, not to count even the other two services, but in this room alone, we have an abundance of God's grace. We have people who will make cheesecakes and painting classes in order to share God's grace and love with people all over the world. There are people in this room who are teachers, who are committed to sharing the knowledge and love of God with one another. There are people who love making this a warm atmosphere by being greeters and ushers and welcoming all into this place. Some of you love spending time, even hours at a time, visiting homebound members of this church, sharing yourself with them, and even taking some of themselves in return and growing from it. Some of you know that your toolbox belongs in your truck as you go and help other people, and you never stop sharing those tools in that toolbox with anyone who has any sort of need. Some of you spend large portions of your day praying for the sake of others. When we take just a moment then to look around us at all the gifts and all the passions that God's grace has given this community alone, it becomes abundantly clear that there is so much that we can do together. As you look to the future of St. Mark, of your own family, of the community at large, the only way we can imagine what God has in store for us is by facing the world through this lens of abundance. As we heard in the Christmas season, the angels tell Mary and Joseph and the shepherds, "Fear not." As Jesus tells us through his actions in this story today, the party is just beginning. It's far from over. God has given us more grace than any of us could ever need. Amen.